There was a time this show of unity would have been unthinkable.
I'm sure that our ancestors could not have guessed how far we would come in our struggle for peace.
The year was 1943. The site, New Zealand's only POW camp. Those are indisputable facts. But what really happened here on February the 25th was for a long time covered up, after Japanese prisoners of war were fatally shot during a peaceful sit-in. They were refusing to work, but what happened next and why is unclear. The result, though, was 49 dead men, one of them a New Zealand guard who was accidentally killed.
I would say the majority of New Zealanders have no idea that A, there was a Featherston prisoner of war camp, and B, what happened here.
Government Minister Tracy Martin is linked to the incident by family. An officer took her granddad's pistol and fired the first shot.
It was probably the most traumatic experience he had in the whole of his life.
Also at today's remembrance service, the daughter of Walter Palvin, the fallen guard.
I find it absolutely excellent that a part of our history that was buried for so long is acknowledged and is out in the open.
This garden now symbolises peace, but plans for its creation prompted angry exchanges for many years. Even after it was finished, the trees had to be replanted after vandals ripped them out.
The older generation, unfortunately, they'd like to hang on to things that weren't supposed to be hanging on to. And forgiveness now is coming through very strong with the Japanese community.
Forgiveness and acknowledgement, the way forward from a dark day in New Zealand history. Kate Nicker-Williams, One News.
Cover up. Peaceful sit-in. Older generation holding on to things that aren't supposed to be hung on to, apparently. What do you mean we should no longer remember history and the brutal reality of war and the first generation of New Zealanders not to know what a real war is? You have also probably read it as well. It was a massacre, comparable even to the Christchurch Mosque terrorist attack. Featherston was none of this, and it is a disgrace to the small band of New Zealand veterans still left alive. Their names are now being tarnished. I'm about to readdress the peace narrative that exists today. Give you a totally new perspective as to what happened on the morning of Thursday, the 25th of February 1943, and in the days leading up to the mutiny. The Japanese in the camp were far from a united group. For starters, half their numbers consisted of non-combatant drafted workers and semi-military conscripted troops, and they were all placed in camps 1, 3 and 4, the majority of which were content with conditions, working in the camp gardens and in the small-scale factories which made up framing and chimneys, that sort of thing. In Camp 2 were the real soldiers, for want of a better term, mostly sailors captured in Guadalcanal. Within Camp 2 was a hardcore, fanatics who wanted to go on fighting. They saw their surrender as a black mark against themselves and their fellow prisoners, couldn't contemplate returning to Japan having surrendered and living the rest of their lives branded a coward. They wanted to go down fighting and take as many guards, and if necessary civilians too, down with them. This hardcore weren't adverse to spitting on guards or throwing rocks at them. The Suicide Squad, as they were dubbed, weren't popular even within their own comrades. They might not have wanted to go to work, but by and large they didn't want to charge the armed guards Banzai style either. On one previous occasion, the Suicide Squad was found to be hoarding weapons to launch a mass escape. This discovery was only made after the mainstream Japanese soldiers dobbed them in. Increasingly the hardcore became uncontrollable. Regardless of whether the 25th of February occurred the way it did, this group would have given rise to bloodshed at some point. Of the 49 Japanese that were killed that day, about half were from this hardcore. They came armed on the 25th with whatever they could lay their hands on: rocks, bludgeons, and what we would now call kung fu stars cut out from roofing iron. Peaceful sit down? My ass. Some wanted to go down fighting, and they got their wish. For the moderates, all they had to do to sort the situation out was return to their barracks. They were asked repeatedly, over 2 hours, miscalculated what would be the reaction from the New Zealanders. When things began to turn nasty, a warning shot was fired to show the guards meant business. This was ignored. Another shot was fired to wound the Japanese commander in order to gain control. And this went through the commander's arm, exited, and struck a soldier behind him straight between the eyes, killing him instantly. It was then the situation spiralled out of control. Prisoners charged, rocks were thrown, and bullets began getting fired. The portrait the event was later covered up as utter bullshit. The main reason events were initially kept under wraps was the government feared Japanese retaliation, and with good reason. Japanese treatment of prisoners of war in World War II was barbaric. Let's get some context, please. This is a Japanese prisoner of war photographed at Featherston. The other one is a British soldier upon his release from Japanese prisoner of war camp in Hong Kong. Beheadings, not just of soldiers, but of civilians, which I'll get to later. Rape of Australian and Dutch women, and that's before we even get to the excesses of Nanking. Compare this to the Japanese soldier in hospital after the so-called massacre at Featherston. In fact, Featherston locals bought all the soldiers in hospital, Kiwis and Japanese alike, baking, cards and gifts, not bayonets to finish them off. There is no comparison between the barbarity of the Japanese and the conduct of New Zealand troops in World War II. The inquiry was overseen by the Swiss, who had a representative at the proceedings. The outcome of the inquiry wasn't a whitewash. Their conclusion was there was fault on both sides, which arose largely from cultural differences and communications problems. When the report was issued and was made public, the Japanese government made complaints via the British. It was a massacre. This was from a regime which was not even a full signatory to the Geneva Convention, and at the very time this process was occurring, was working to death 120,000 detainees building the Burma Railway. The neutral Swiss soon poured water over those accusations by stating, "When did you ever get to hear that? Nor when did you get to hear about the New Zealand guard that was killed and the other 9 New Zealanders wounded from ricocheting bullets?" The Japanese held contempt for the guards and wrongly believed working for the enemy was against international conventions. All the Japanese troops in Camp 2, not just the hardcore suicide squad, thought working for the enemy was something that coolies did, and they were all above this. Considered the guards to be their inferior because they were not frontline troops. They gravely underestimated the fighting spirits of the New Zealanders that day. Their bad knee or age may have rendered them ineligible for full service, they did not lack for bravery or discipline when the time came. This bravery has been trampled over. The camp, after all, held 650 prisoners, and there were only 100 guards, not all of which were on station at any one time. Some were off escorting prisoners, off duty, in other parts of the camp. The camp itself was grossly undermanned, a fact the authorities had brought to the attention of Army HQ in the days leading up to the 25th. On that day you had 240 prisoners in the yard of Camp 2 and 47 troops. But back quickly to the inquiry. There was no legal precedent for New Zealand to refer to. Since the Japanese were not interested in signing the Geneva Convention, the best New Zealand could do was to consider the Japanese to be German POWs and proceed with the inquiry under those terms. Another distortion that has somehow become gospel was a role played by the guard Jack Owen. What is undeniable is Jack Owen was positioned above the Japanese in the courtyard, possessed one of the 4 active Thompson machine guns. These held 50 rounds and Owen fired off the entire magazine. In total, 220 rounds were fired that day, 70 of which came from Tommy guns, the rest from standard issue rifles. They held a 7-round magazine. It is clear Owen played a large role in the events in terms of those killed and wounded, on both sides. Much has been made about Owen's motivation, given his brother was part of a contingent of New Zealand prisoners and civilians beheaded by the Japanese in Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. There is no evidence Jack even knew his brother had been murdered 3 months earlier when he was spraying the courtyard in a vengeful act of malice. The reports of what happened, a true massacre, never came out till the next year. A far more plausible reason for Owen firing off so many rounds was his was the only Tommy gun set on automatic. To fire off 50 rounds from a Tommy gun takes this long. 1, 2. In summary, this was not a massacre. Rather, it was more akin to a mutiny led by a die-hard group of fanatical Japanese who either met a glorious death they so craved, or grossly underestimated the reaction of the New Zealand troops, who they all regarded to be their subordinates. Cultural and translation issues also played their part. Shit can of course occur in war. Something modern journalists who have lived with the freedoms these people fought for, including the guards at Featherston, seem to have forgotten. Comparing that day with the terrorist attack in Christchurch is unacceptable and unfathomable. The guards at Featherston have been trashed for too long. If you agree, give this video a like. I will spot you next time. Bye for now.